Let's begin. Here are the threats. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes bishop. Rook takes bishop. Here are the checks. Queen takes rook, check. Bishop to h7, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen takes rook, check. Bishop takes queen. Rook to e8, checkmate. Another puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes knight. Checks in puzzle position are queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen takes pawn, check. Pawn takes queen. Bishop to a6, checkmate. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes bishop. Knight takes rook. Knight takes knight. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to d8, check. Knight to c7, check. Knight to g7, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to d8, check. King to f7. Queen to f6, check. King to g8. Queen takes bishop, checkmate. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are queen to h5, checkmate. Queen to g4, check. Queen to f4, check. Queen to e3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to h5, checkmate. Next puzzle, here are the threats. Queen takes rook. Rook takes pawn, check. The checks are knight to e7, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes pawn, check. King to h8. Rook to g8, check. King takes rook. Knight to e7, checkmate. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to f5, check. Queen to f3, check. Queen to a3, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to f3, check. King to e7. Bishop to h4, checkmate. One more. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Rook takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook takes pawn, check. King to h8. Rook to g8, check. King takes rook. Rook to g1, check. Bishop to g5. Rook takes bishop, checkmate. Next puzzle, threats in puzzle position are queen takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to f6, check. Queen to h6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen to f6, check. King to g8. Knight to h6, checkmate. Next puzzle, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Rook takes pawn, check. f5, check. h5, check. The answer is f5, check. King to h6. Bishop to e3, check. g5. Pawn takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. h5, checkmate. Let's continue. Threats in this position are rook takes knight. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook takes pawn, check. Pawn takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. King to g8. Queen to h8, check. King to f7. Rook to h7, check. King to e6. Rook to h6, check. Knight to g6. Rook takes knight, check. King to d5. Queen to d4, checkmate. Another one. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes bishop. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e3, check. Queen to d4, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to e3, check. King to h1. Queen to f3, check. Pawn takes queen. Rook takes rook, check. Bishop takes rook. Rook takes bishop, checkmate. Next puzzle, the threats are: knight takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Knight to a6, check. Knight to d7, check. Knight to e6, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight to d3, check. Knight to b3, check. Knight to a4, check. The best move in puzzle position is: knight takes pawn, check. King to e1. Bishop to f2, checkmate. Another puzzle, the threats are: queen takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to g8, check. Queen to h8, check. Queen to h6, check. Queen to g7, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight to d7, check. Knight to g6, check. Solution to the puzzle is: knight to d7, check. Rook takes knight. Queen to h8, checkmate. Another puzzle, threats in this position are: pawn takes pawn. The checks are: rook to a4, check. Rook to d3, check. Rook to d2, check. The puzzle is solved using: rook to d3, check. King to c4. Rook to a4, checkmate. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are: rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: rook to a5, check. g4, check. The answer is: king to h3. g5. g4, checkmate. Another puzzle, threats in this position are: queen takes rook. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop, check. Here are the checks. Queen to f5, check. Queen to g4, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes pawn, check. Bishop takes rook. Queen to f5, checkmate. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are: knight takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are: knight to b6, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight to e7, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight to f4, check. Knight to e3, check. Knight to c3, check. Knight to b4, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: knight to e7, check. King to h8. Knight to g6, check. Pawn takes knight. Rook to h3, checkmate. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Rook takes knight. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is: queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes queen. Rook to c1, check. Queen to d1. Rook takes queen, check. Rook to f1. Rook takes rook, checkmate. Let's continue. The threats are: bishop takes queen, check. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes queen, check. The checks are: bishop takes queen, check. Queen takes knight, check. Queen to g2, checkmate. Queen to h1, check. Queen takes queen, check. Queen to d1, check. Answer to this puzzle is: queen to g2, checkmate. Next, the threats are: queen takes knight. Checks in this position are: knight to g3, check. The best move in puzzle position is: knight to g3, check. King takes pawn. Queen to h5, check. King to g1. Queen to h1, checkmate. One more. Threats in this position are: rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: queen to f3. Pawn takes queen. Rook to g6, check. King to h1. Bishop takes pawn, checkmate. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Promotes to queen, check. Promotes to bishop, check. Queen to g5, check. Queen to h6, check. The answer is: queen to h6, check. King to h8. Queen to f6, checkmate. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: there are no threats in this position. The checks are: bishop to d8, check. Bishop to f6, check. Bishop to g5, check. Bishop to h4, check. Bishop to d6, check. Bishop to c5, check. Bishop to b4, check. Bishop to a3, check. The best move in puzzle position is bishop to h4, check. King to d2. Queen to e3, check. King to d1. Queen to e1, checkmate. Another puzzle. Here are the threats. Rook takes bishop. King takes rook. The checks are: knight to f8, check. Rook to h6, check. Rook to g5, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook to g5, check. King takes knight. Rook to h1, check. Rook to h2. Rook takes rook, check. Bishop to h3. Rook takes bishop, checkmate. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: bishop to g4, check. Bishop to e4, check. g4, check. Rook to e3, check. Rook to f1, check. Solution to the puzzle is g4, check. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop to e4, checkmate. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.